Right. Okay. So, as I pointed out, today's lecture is fundamentally a timeline, creation of a timeline in terms of history, culture, and literature, as we move through a huge period in literary history between 1600 to 1712. One of the most fascinating and flux-ridden periods of English history, which laid the basis of what we call our early modernity. Now, before I begin this period, let me just take a quick look at what went earlier. And you have the Elizabethan age from 1558 onwards. So Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558. You have a remarkable period of stability, even though initially Elizabeth has to contend with Mary, Queen of Scots. But you have the Church of England dominating the landscape. You have a degree of religious stability, the Church of England. You also have the rise of the universities and the university wits, the flowering of the Renaissance in England, at least, the writing of the classical, or following the classical paradigms. You have the sonnets of Wyatt, Surrey. Sidney, of course, writes the epic, the Fairy Queen. You have Shakespeare, born in 1564. Shakespeare was died in 1616. You have Ben Jonson, who is tentatively of the same period, although he dies in 1637. Ben Jonson is born 1572. You have Bacon, Francis Bacon, born 1561 to 1626. Therefore, you have a wide range of literatures who are operating with different forms. Bacon, for example, lays the foundation of the English essay. Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, experimenting and indigenizing the classical forms of tragedy, comedy. You have John Lilly. You have the Senecan revenge tragedy in Kids, the Spanish tragedy. So a lot of classical forms are being experimented with. Literature is opening up into a broad new horizon. There are scientific discoveries, experimentations being made. Science, of course, at this point of time being called natural philosophy. And you have a sense of excitement, a sense of optimism, and a great flowering of what you can call literature and the arts during this period. And therefore, combined with this is political, religious stability to a certain extent, although I will admit that the Catholic, Anglican, Protestant conflict was still very much in vogue. But there was a certain degree of newness to this world, which initiates a spirit of self-formation, Renaissance, what we have called, or Greenblatt has called, Renaissance self-fashioning. You have Castiglione's Courtier being written earlier, Machiavelli's Prince, and Spencer in the Fairy Queen writes that the aim is to fashion a gentleman of noble virtue and discipline. Right. Therefore, fashioning of a new man with knowledge and with a certain kind of what you can call intellectual sophistication is what the Renaissance is looking at. So this is 16 till the 1600s. Now, in 1600, something very interesting happens, although we will be talking about the Jacobean age, which starts in 1603. But 1600 is also very significant for Indian history because it marks the formation of the East India Company, something which will determine our fates for the next 200, 300 odd years. So this is the background through which we come to the 17th century. But with the 17th century, things start changing to a certain degree. Now, Elizabeth dies childless and is succeeded by her cousin James VI of Scotland, who becomes James I in England, and thereby there is this entire territory which is coming together, England, Scotland, and Ireland, and James becomes the first Stuart leader. James is also in Latin known as Jacobus, as Debarpita was mentioning, and therefore this marks the initiation of the Jacobean period in English literature. Interestingly, the first East India Company ship lands in Ceylon in 1603 and sends back a huge cache of spices from Sri Lanka. This is the first time that the East India Company has made huge profits. Right. Now, this is 24th March 1603. Now, 1609 sees, of course, during this period, drama changes to a certain degree. And you see, once again, with James I coming to the throne, the integrity, or I'll say the close synergy between the Church of England and the monarch is fractured to a certain extent. And therefore, there is a new atmosphere of tension, uncertainty, and a degree of tragic foreboding. You will see that this early half of the century marks the beginning of Shakespeare's great tragedies, and also begins with a certain dimension of the awareness of how greed, uncertainty together manifest itself in society. Therefore, you have a movement towards a new form of literature, although it had started in the Elizabethan age, a city comedy. Now, city comedy talks about London life. Decker's Shoemaker's Holiday is an early example. But more importantly, I would suggest that, it is at this point of time that the corruption which is endemic within the city becomes the subject matter of satire. So there's a certain darkness, I am arguing, that we locate in the literature of the period. There's the admixture of tragedy and comedy in the plays of Beaumont and Fletcher, Marston and Middleton, for example, and even comedy becomes darkly satiric, talking about human greed and the collapse of institutions. Now, it is within this period that he will situate the first text of your paper, that is Johnson's Volpone. Volpone, which uses a beast fable, and you will find that all the characters are so motivated by money. You have Voltaire, the lawyer, you have Corvino, you have Corbaccio, all of them who corrupt the institutions of the father and the son, of the husband and the wife, for the sake of money. Therefore, you have, as Weber has called it, early capitalism and its clash with morality generating a comedy of deep satire. Right. This is something which you need to observe. Therefore, there is a gradual darkening of the horizon of literature, and it's therefore producing, dark city comedies. It is producing the genre of tragicomedy. This is very important. Right. Now, 1609 is, of course, a very important date in Irish history, where the plantation of Ulster sees Protestants moving on to confiscated Irish land. Now, Ireland was predominantly Catholic, and this is where the Protestants move into Ulster, and you have the beginning of what will be called the Great Irish Divide between Northern Ireland and Ireland, as it were, thereby generating a bloody conflict that is still festering in certain ways. 1611 is a very important date in terms of prose literature of the period, because this is the date of the publication of the King James's Bible. Several different versions of the Bible were available earlier, and this becomes, clarified, and the authorized version of the Bible is, as it were, put forward. But please remember, religion still remains a major force in culture, and religious divisions deeply rent English society, especially the division between the Catholics and the Protestants. In England, of course, the church is the Anglican Church. Right. Now, 1613, I locate James I's daughter, Elizabeth, marrying Frederick V, Elector Palatine, and this is the beginning of what we will call the Hanoverian dynasty, the House of Hanover in Germany. Now, this will become important, especially because the Hanoverian regime is the one which will come in the 18th century, and then will linger throughout the till the 20th. So the basic bloodline that would be created for the 18th to the 20th centuries is the bloodline that is going to be established through this marriage. Now, 23rd April 1616, William Shakespeare dies. Shakespeare's folio is published. You had earlier Shakespeare's plays available as quartos. The first folio is published, and you have I'm sorry, just excuse me. You have the what we call within the stage, there is a glut of forms. You have city comedy, you have tragicomedy, you have tragedies, Senecan tragedies, you have classical comedies, all of them jostling for space. A very important genre also arises during this point of time, and that is the Jacobean masque, the masque which is a pageant almost, and which is presented only in the court, aristocratic form, which many of these dramatists experiment with. Now, also important during this period, I haven't mentioned him as yet, is the pressure that new discoveries in science, in geography is being made. You have the first records in 1619 of the Africans in the British North American colonies, and there is a gradual shifting from their status from indentured servants to slaves. And this is also a very shameful chapter in British history, where slavery gradually gains root. But you have numerous explorations. The New World is about to be discovered, and you have great milestones in geography and science, and therefore a new kind of poetry emerges. A new poetry which seeks to amalgamate the discourses of love of the erstwhile Elizabethan sonnets with the new knowledges that come through. Therefore, its metaphors become different. What is the difference? Earlier, the Elizabethan lyric would talk about the two souls becoming one. In this poetry, you have the two lovers as the two hemispheres joining to form the perfect sphere, which the sphere being the symbol of the perfect universe, of the state of perfection. Therefore, disparate ideas or disparate experiences, one of love, one of science, are being yoked together violently in strange conceits or metaphors, and you actually have the rise of metaphysical poetry during this time. Now, John Donne is, of course, born in the Elizabethan age, but writes well into the Jacobean age, the major poems all being published during this period. This is also the poetry of Marvell, for example, Vaughan, for example. Once again, religion is yoked together with images like the pulley. So the relationship between God and man, which is one of closeness, friction, doubt, this complexity is manifested in the image of man in a relationship with God in terms of the metaphor of the pulley. Therefore, this is the metaphysical conceit, yoking together of disparate elements of experience. Right. Now, of course, when you read or when you have read Elizabethan and metaphysical poetry, you will have noted these differences. But coming back to my timeline, 1619, you have the first records in the British colonies, and therefore you have this great leap in slavery. 1620, August, the Pilgrim Fathers sail for America in the Mayflower, right? And attempting to escape religious persecution, they sail for the New World and land at Massachusetts, and they start what is a new continent, as it were, civilization on a new continent, displacing the indigenous people, and this is the founding of the American colonization by the British. Now, 27th March 1625, James I dies, and Charles I comes to power. Now, James had been a difficult king. He often went out disguised to find out how his subjects were doing, and there was an uneasy relationship with the king. The king, of course, as you remember, was considered to be God's representative on earth. But since you have the Catholic-Protestant divide, the status of the king was largely eroded at this point of time. But even then, James had managed to keep the people together. Now, Charles turns out to be an extremely arrogant and often very brutally violent king. Right. So James dies at the age of 57, and his son Charles, then 24 years old, is proclaimed as king. Now, in 1627, throughout this period, of course, England has been, you have the Protestant powers, you have England, you have Holland, and England is in conflict for maritime superiority, colonization with the French, the Spanish. Although during Elizabeth's time, there was the defeat of the Spanish Armada, as it were, you have a constant conflict between the British and the French. And in 1627, the English forces are defeated in France, and the English army is commanded by the Duke of Buckingham, who's also extremely unpopular with the people. Buckingham loses this battle, and the English are forced to retreat. 1628, 23rd August, the Duke of Buckingham is assassinated. So you are seeing that what we locate is slowly Charles's reign is moving towards a kind of a crisis. Now, 1629, England, of course, is now divided squarely. You already have a parliament which sort of controls the strings of monarchy, as it were, the strings of the purses. Without parliament's approval, you cannot go to war, you cannot raise armies, and therefore parliament by now is in conflict with the king. And Charles I in 1629 dissolves parliament and begins 11 years of personal rule. So the agreement that you had in the Elizabethan age between the queen and parliament collapses, and you have an autocratic monarch who seeks to roughshod the parliament and rule personally. Right. And this period, this 11-year period, starting from 1629, is considered to be a very dark period in the history of England. And you have continuous element of festering, deep unease, deep confrontation within the people. Gradually, what we consider to be the stability of the Elizabethan period is being rent apart, so that England is gradually hurtling towards what we will call the Civil War. The 23rd July 1637, Charles tries to promulgate a new prayer book, and this causes a riot in Edinburgh. And Edinburgh, once this entire conflict breaks out, Charles, of course, loses the support of the Scottish people at large. And this becomes one of the major reasons for Charles's loss, or Charles's defeat later on to the Parliamentarians. And 28th February 1638, the Scots begin to sign the National Covenant to prevent religious innovation. So they are hell-bent not on accepting the new common book, or to resist all religious innovations, right? And therefore, we can see already that there is a tremendous sense of dissent, both in England and in Scotland, against the king. Now, the king, of course, is already in conflict with the French, and he needs funds, and therefore he calls Parliament on 13th April 1640, and this is what is called the Short Parliament. Charles is forced to summon a new Parliament after 11 years of personal rule. So from 1629, Parliament is dissolved. 1640, it is reassembled, right? But you see, the Parliamentarians force the issue, and there is again resentment between the king and the Parliamentarians. The Parliamentarians ask him to reverse his domestic policy, and Charles, sort of with his arrogance, dismisses Parliament within a month. So the fragile truce that seemed to be possible between the king and Parliament is disrupted once again. Now, at the root is not only religion, at the root also is the way in which Charles seeks to sort of impose autocratic rule, censorship on writings, on the people, on parliamentarians in general, that you actually have the deeper divisions between what I will call the royalist forces and the parliamentary forces. Now, 1640, in August, the Scots march against England. Scottish army finds Charles's forces waiting for them on the southern bank of the River Tyne. Tyne is in Newcastle, and they defeat the English infantry, and Charles has to retreat and agree to a humbling truce. 1640, this is a very important year, isn't it? You know, everything seems to happen in 1640. Long Parliament opens at Westminster, and Charles is once again forced to call Parliament so that he can raise funds for an expedition. But instead of providing the king with financial assistance, many of the members of Parliament voice very angry protest against Charles. So the conflict that we can see was festering is now coming to a climax. And Charles, in 1642, this is early 1642, January 1642, he tries to arrest 5 leading members of Parliament. So now you have the conflict absolutely in the open, and fearing that his opponents in Parliament were not only determined to seize political control, but also to impeach his Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, Charles marches into the House of Commons and attempts to arrest 5 leading members of Parliament. Forewarned, they slip away, and Charles is forced to leave empty-handed. So Charles is seen almost as a king from whom power is slipping out. The Catholic-Protestant divide is at a terrible point. England is at war with Scotland. England is losing to France, and thereby there is a very, very strong sense of resentment that is taking place against the king. Right. Now, 22nd August 1642 is a very, very crucial date in English history, because civil war breaks out and Charles raises his standard at Nottingham against the Parliamentary Army. Right. So he summons his loyal subjects to join against his enemies, and in Parliament, Charles signals the start of the Civil War, and in almost a kind of prophetic portent, the standard is blown down the same night by a strong and unruly wind. So his flag, as it were, collapses even before the war is fought. 23rd October 1642, the Royalist and the Parliamentarian armies clash at Warwickshire. And you see, let me also explain that at this point of time, London is predominantly, parliamentarian, right? And you have the Royalist supporters primarily in the counties. Therefore, and London is the seat of money. It is the capital. It is the source of funds. Therefore, it is imperative that Charles take London and defeat the Parliamentarians. So he advances on London from the Welsh marches, and the Earl of Essex confronts him at Warwickshire, and it is this that marks the bloodiest period of the Civil War, and a series of wars follow, so that the Civil War is not only, not only deeply divisive, but also a lengthy period where England's resources are tremendously stretched. Now, on 2nd July 1644, so you already have 2 years of the Civil War, the Scottish and Parliamentarian armies destroy Charles's northern army, and they are, with this defeat, the northern part of England is fundamentally lost to the king. Now, Charles will still believe the Scots at some point of time and will try to buy a truce with them, but the Scots will betray him and turn him over to the Parliamentarians. Now, in 1645, so 3 years, right, you have the Battle of Cornwall, and Parliament decides to fund a new army, and from separate small armies of parliamentarians, you have a consolidated army, which is named the New Model Army, and very importantly, 2 people lead it. One is Sir Thomas Fairfax, but the second name is more important because he's going to be the new protectorate later on, and that is Oliver Cromwell, who is the second in command of this New Model Army. And it is this figure who is going to be crucial in the later political battles that will take place in England. 1645, 14th June, the Royalists are crushed in Nottinghamshire, and almost the battle of the Civil War is almost on the verge of collapse. Now, something very interesting has also taken place on stage. 1642, with the outbreak of the Civil War and gradual rise of Puritanism in England, you actually have the theatres all closed down. So from 1642 to 1660, English theatre closes down. 1644 is also very important because you are reading Milton, and 1644 Milton decides to publish a tract against censorship. It is titled Aeropagitica, one of the first tracts against censorship that was very profoundly written to protest against authoritarianism and the ways in which the freedom of the press was being curbed. 1646, Charles surrenders to the Scots. He believes that the Scots might, throw in his, come with him, and he sort of tries to offer consolations to them. But the Scots hand him over to the Parliamentary Army. That's the price that they paid for him, £400,000. And the Scots retreat to Edinburgh, and the English parliamentarians have effectively won the battle. England is now primarily parliamentary. And you see the two parties that are going to be formed later on. You have the Tories, who are the King's supporters, the Royalists, very often landed gentry, and you have the Whigs, or the parliamentarians, the liberals, as it were, who are the Whig party, and English politics will revolve around these two parties. The one, which is the Tory party, will later on manifest itself as the Conservatives, and the Whigs will be transformed into the Labour Party, of course. So you have this society is driven into two distinct halves. You see, for England, it is also very difficult because, with political instability and war with England comes economic instability. And therefore, the force of colonialism that England had is supposedly threatened during this period. Of course, the East India Company is still, venturing out into Africa. Slavery is at its peak. The East India Company is about to visit India and will come to the court of Aurangzeb and make their presence felt. But at this point of time, England internally is divided into the supporters of the king and the supporters of the parliamentarians. So it's a deeply fractured, deeply divided binary society, as it were. Now, in 1648, the parliamentarians start to squabble amongst themselves, and you have this new model army turning out a majority of the parliamentarians, right? So 180 members are being purged by Colonel Pride of this new model army, and 40 members were still more arrested. So you have a remaining of 160 parliamentarians who formulate the laws, and therefore this truncated, parliament is called the rump parliament, as it were. So 1648, 1649, you see, Charles is tried for treason, and after the trial is executed. Now, this is a major event after the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. This is the king being executed, and this sends shockwaves across Europe, as it were. Charles, of course, meets his maker with great dignity, and his last word on the gallows is, as it were, remember. Right. Now, with this, you have the establishment of parliamentary Puritan rule. And this is when you have a new thrust towards deeply Protestant religious poetry. And this is where, of course, you will locate the poetry of Milton and the other puritanical poets. So this is another important turn in the history of England at probably one of the most important turns in the history of England at this point of time. So this is where you have a major shift in English history, 1649, with the death of King Charles. Now, during this period of time, 1651, Charles II is crowned King of Scotland. Charles's son, Charles II, strikes a bargain with the Scots, and he becomes the King of Scotland, and thereby another civil war sort of seems to evolve on the horizon as he threatens to invade England and take his throne. Right. But in 1651, Cromwell is the general now. He defeats Charles II at the Battle of Worcester, and this is when the young king is forced into exile in France. Now, it's important to note this because in France, Charles II is going to be part of a cultural scenario which will involve French new drama of Molière, for example, French new comedy, French heroic tragedy, and you have the French court, which is far more amoral, if not downright immoral, than Puritan England. So England is predominantly Puritan at this point of time. Theatre is banned, whereas in France you have a much more libertine, amoral court where Charles II flees, and therefore he's going to bring in French dramatic traditions into English literature once he returns, leading to the rise of Restoration comedy. Now, 1653, Oliver Cromwell makes himself Lord Protector. He becomes almost a de facto king, right? And of course, Parliament has squabbled amongst themselves, and Cromwell sort of seizes power and summons a new Parliament, and he becomes a pseudo monarch of England at this point of time. Of course, Cromwell is extremely popular with the British Army. Now, 1653 to 1658, Oliver Cromwell rules with an iron hand. But you see, while we will see the authoritarian streak in Cromwell's ascension to power, we'll also remember that the Civil War is very important in the history of England, because willy-nilly it sort of signals the end of the monarchy, that the monarchy is an institution that will be largely sort of disbanded after 1660 and so on and so forth, that real power will lay with the Parliament. This lays the basis of parliamentary democracy in England, one. Secondly, what we also locate is a certain amount of participation of the middle classes, as it were, in politics. Please remember that there's nothing called the universal electorate at this point of time. Universal adult franchisee is not available. You know, it's only a secluded number of people who can vote. But gradually, what happens in social terms is that the middle class, especially the traders, start to gain a lot more prominence, replacing the landed gentry as the class of power. Now, this is going to be a very important movement. Thirdly, what is very interesting is that, you know, London starts to develop phenomenally with trade and commerce, with the what you can call some period of stability after 1651. You have a fantastic growth of London. You know, it becomes from the fifth largest city of the world by 1600, or at least by 1660 or 1700, it has become the largest metropolis of Europe and becomes phenomenally important as a trading center. So when you talk about, say, the Spectator papers later on, we will see that Addison is talking about the sea as a British common. England's powers in terms of maritime prowess has become extraordinary. Colonialism, slave tradery has become extremely potent. The colonies are flowering, wealth is pouring in, London is becoming phenomenally important. We are moving towards the heydays of the Augustan age. But 1658, but still there is a remarkable, conflict between king and parliament. Royalists and parliamentarians are still squabbling. England is still slightly unstable. And 1658, once Cromwell dies, his son, Oliver Cromwell, comes to power, right? And Oliver is extremely incapable, resigns after a period, and England declines into financial chaos. And there is a strong dispute between the army and the parliamentarians. And by this time, they realize that they require a figurehead who will unite England, that there will be parliament, but they need the king to be that head who will unite the different fragments of society. And therefore, it is with this that Charles II is invited to return from France and become the king once again. This is called the restoration of monarchy. The restoration of monarchy. So monarchy, the king who was beheaded and kingship which was lost, is now once again brought back to power. In fact, there is a remarkable portrait which I'm not able to share today. I will do sometime later on, where there is Charles II leading a procession back to England, and that becomes the moment when the British people rally around the king. There's great optimism once again, and there is a tremendous excitement about the new England, which is, if you remember, scientifically strong, which has a very strong parliamentary tradition now, and which is going to be a veritable seat of democracy, maritime power, and colonialism. By the way, in between this, already you have, in 1651, Thomas Hobbes writing a treatise called Leviathan. Now, Leviathan, which we will do once we finish the timeline, is a treatise on what is going to be the nature of man-like. And Hobbes says man is somebody who is like an animal. Human life is nasty, brutish, and short, that man will continuously squabble amongst themselves. You remember the parliamentarians doing that, the Civil War, and English people doing that. Therefore, what is the state going to be like? Hobbes says that the state has to be omnipowerful, immensely powerful, omnipotent, so that, it is like a monster. Leviathan, the sovereign, is like a monster. But Hobbes makes an important point. He says that we will create this monster together by surrendering our rights to him. The sovereign becomes powerful because we transfer our rights to him. Right. Therefore, an all-powerful state. This is an important landmark. 1651. You have had Milton in 1654 writing about the freedom of press. You have in 1651 Thomas Hobbes initiating what we will call the basis of modern political science. So 1660 marks the closure of one chapter of English history, the closure of the chapter of a bloody civil war, a revolution, as it were, the emphasis on parliament, and the final restoration of monarchy. In between, England has executed a king. Social divisions between the Whigs and the Tories are there, between the landed gentry and the new traders, between the Catholics and the Protestants. Still there is tremendous division. At the same time, with Charles II coming back to power, the theatres are reopened, and there is a new optimism that the dark clouds of what was a bloody civil war will now be dispelled by a period of coming together and progressing. At the same time, the people are conscious that the king cannot be allowed to be authoritarian, and therefore they need to pass legislation whereby there will be laws which will limit the power of the king, ensure the freedom of the individual, and ensure that there is division of power within various parts of the state. Therefore, what we are looking at is a period in English history where political liberty will be a very important consideration, where England is standing on the threshold of remarkable scientific discoveries. You will remember that in 1640s, Robert Boyle has already discovered the mechanism of the pump. You have had remarkable discoveries in chemistry by Lavoisier of finding hydrogen and oxygen in composing water. You have Harvey, who is on the threshold of discovering the circulation of blood. 1662 is going to be the date in which Isaac Newton is going to found the academy, right? And therefore you have the discoveries of physics and optics on the horizon. We are looking at a period where English history is going to move away from the darkness of Puritanism, of censorship, of political rivalry, into a new found confidence, stability, and economic progress. That period will begin with 1660, and that will be the subject of our next discussion, which tentatively will be tomorrow. Right. It is with that that I am stopping the recording for this particular class, and now I would invite you to put forward your questions.